I'll be speaking with Professor Norton Mezvinsky. He was Distinguished Connecticut State University Professor at Central Connecticut State University until his retirement in 2009. Currently, he's president of the International Council for Middle East Studies in Washington, D.C. He was a colleague and close friend of Israel Shahak, the late professor of chemistry and human rights activist, who will be the main topic of this interview. Good morning.
Well, good morning.
And you're in New York presently.
I am indeed in New York City, the epicenter of the virus.
And I trust you're in good health.
Thank goodness, yes.
All right, we're going to be talking about Israel Shahak and your relation to him. But first, let's talk about your background. I understand you were born in Iowa.
I was born in a town called Red Oak, Iowa in 1932. First Jewish family ever in Red Oak. When I was 8 days old and I had the circumcision or bris, my father invited the whole town to the city park. They had to bring the mohel to do the circumcision from Omaha, Nebraska. And the next day, the headlines in the Red Oak Daily newspaper was first Jewish boy born in Red Oak.
Wow.
And we then moved to Ames. And in Ames, when we first went there, 1933, there were 3 Jewish families.
Wow.
So 3 was an increase from 1. Now there are, of course, more.
Now, where were you educated?
I went to University of Iowa and got my BA. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin and got my PhD in history. And then I went for 2 years. I was a research fellow at Harvard.
Mm. And when did you start college teaching and where?
Well, I started college teaching after Harvard, and I started at the University of Michigan as an instructor. And I went to City College in the mid-'60s. And I was at City College until I got the offer to go to what was then Central Connecticut State College, which I had never heard of.
Uh-huh.
And I said to the chairman of the history department who interviewed me at a conference, I thanked him, but I said, I didn't tell him I've never heard of the place. But he invited me to come, and to use a really trite phrase, the offer was too good to turn down. So then I went and I stayed there. I stayed there for 43 years. 43
years, wow. So when did you get first interested in Palestine and Israel?
Well, I'll tell you, here's the story. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family in Ames, Iowa. My father became the patron saint of Ames, Iowa, actually. He was an Orthodox Jew. He started me at age 5. He took me to Des Moines, which is 27 miles away, as you know, the capital and the largest city in Iowa. And I had a private teacher who was Orthodox from age 5 to 13. My father told me, you have to go until your bar mitzvah. And then after your bar mitzvah, you have a choice. So I studied with him, and that man taught me almost everything he knew. And then I went to the University of Iowa, and I luckily had very good people there in Wisconsin and at Harvard. That's Jewish education, briefly. But the Zionist thing, we had lots of relatives in Israel. I had one relative who was the major spokesman in the Knesset for all the religious parties for 27 years.
Mm.
So when I started college, I had in my head that I would go for 4 years, get my BA, do my Aliyah, and go to Israel to live.
Mm.
When I became a senior, and I was in a new history honors program, I had to write a thesis for a semester. So I decided to write a thesis on what I then called, at the time, anti-Zionist propaganda in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, I found in the library that there was one American Jewish anti-Zionist organization called the American Council for Judaism. And the executive director at the time was Rabbi Elmer Berger, who of course I'd never heard of. So I wrote him a letter and I told him, I didn't tell him the title of my thesis, but I told him what I was doing, And I said that I've discovered the American Council for Judaism, and I would like to know more about it, so I might be able to include it. So to my surprise, there were no computers. He wrote me a 3-page typed single-space letter, and he explained things, and he sent me a lot of material, a couple boxes of material.
Wow.
I was very impressed. I went through all the material. I had a chapter in my undergraduate thesis on the American Council for Judaism, and what I tried to do was I took the arguments and I refuted them, or tried to, in my chapter. So after I finished the thesis, I then, because Rabbi Elmer Berger had been so kind as to send me all this stuff, I sent him a copy of my thesis with a little note that he might not agree with what I wrote. Then, to my surprise, I got back another very long typed letter from him that even at the time when I was younger, I understood he wrote that with kid gloves on, soft gloves. But he went down every one of my arguments and he just obliterated them. I mean, he tore them totally apart. And I was extremely impressed. And he said at the end of the letter, when and if I came to New York, to let him know, and he would take me to lunch. Well, the family would go to New York once in a while because my mother's sister lived there right across the George Washington Bridge. So we went to New York, and I spent a whole afternoon with Rabbi Elmer Berger, and he almost converted me totally in one afternoon. Then the long and short of this is, I then became an associate of his, and in 1967, while I was still in New York, before I came to Connecticut, he was the vice president then, although he was the ideologue. He ran the American Council for Judaism. I became the executive director of the American Council for Judaism, and I was the closest person to Elmer Berger until he died in the 1990s.
Now, around what year did you write that thesis? Late 1940s?
Wait, you mean my undergraduate thesis?
Yeah, the one about the.
I wrote it in 53.
Oh, 53.
I started. No. I'm sorry, that's not right. I wrote it in 53. I started university in 1950, and I was a senior in 53. And so in 1953, I wrote about the American Council for Judaism.
So
as I did at the time.
So once you got involved with them, of course, you're getting involved with Israel and Palestine and so on.
Then I was all involved, and Elmer Berger was all involved. And then with him first, actually, and then I expanded it. With him first, I made lots of contacts. I mean, he was regularly, he would travel. He'd travel to the Middle East. He'd travel here. He'd lecture. He was very close to them. And at the time, his closest Palestinian friend for a long time, at the time, in the late 60s and in through the 70s, was Fayez Sayegh, who the Kuwaitis gave him he was a real top political scientist. And the Kuwaitis gave him an office in their mission. And he and Elmer Berger, and he was for many years, he was the top Palestinian in the United States who worked with the PLO. And he and Elmer Berger were very close friends. And it actually, that famous resolution, Zionism is racism, that appeared first in the New York Times, that, of course, has been so condemned by all the Zionists. Actually, Fayez Sayegh and Elmer Berger wrote that, and they wrote what went into the New York Times. And I remember at the time that when they wrote it, I sat with them while they were writing it, and I told them, the only thing I told them was, I said, change the title, because if you have the title just in capital letters only, Zionism is racism, I said, all the Zionists will do is they will use the title and they'll attack it, and they will then put in all of their language about what you mean, but you don't say that. It's the rest of it where you list almost all the sins committed by the state of Israel that's important. Change the title. They didn't change the title. And of course, I must say, what I prophesied came true. The Zionists from then to now only refer to the title of that resolution.
Now, did you meet?
First, it was an ad in the New York Times. And then, as you know, it became a resolution that was passed in the United Nations.
Did you meet Israel Shahak through Rabbi Berger?
No, I didn't meet him through. In fact, I'm the one who introduced Israel Shahak and Elmer Berger.
Oh.
What happened was, I brought over in the early 70s, I brought someone you probably knew about. I brought Fawzi al-Asmar, a Palestinian. I brought him to the States. Well, I must say, Uri Davis and I brought him. Uri Davis was then a graduate student at the New School for Social Research in New York, an anti-Zionist Jew, as you know, who was one of the first really active ones.
And an Israeli.
Yeah, and so Uri knew Israel Shahak. And he told me about Israel. But first he told me about Fawzi al-Asmar. And he said, Fawzi, who has written poetry, has been house detained. He lived in Lod, right outside of Tel Aviv, with his parents, and he was house detained. They wouldn't let him out. And so Uri said, the only way he's going to be able to get out of the house is if you and I can arrange to bring him to the United States, which would be a good idea. So we then went to some people I knew in New York and a couple organizations. I remember we got $1,500. At the time, that was enough. And so we used that money, and so we got word to Fawzi. Uri, who knew him, got word to him. And he said, look, I hardly know English. We said, don't worry, come to the States. You can learn English, and you can go on a lecture tour, and you can go with Uri, and I'll go with you, and we can translate the Hebrew. So we brought Fawzi. Now, when Fawzi came, Shahak and Fawzi were friends. Shahak was in London for a semester at the University of London doing his chemistry. And I remember the story. Fawzi stopped in London, and he said to Israel Shahak, I think I should turn around and go home because I've never been to the United States, and I don't even know English. Shahak told him, look, you have a choice. You can go back to Israel. And he said, you know, in Israel, it's limited what good you can do. There are lots of Palestinians, and most of them don't have any voice at all. You can do that, or you can really help your people by going to the United States because you're good and you're smart and you can be helped and you can do your people a lot of good if you go to the United States. Well, that convinced Fawzi. So Fawzi came. And when he came, he, of course, had nothing. And so he came, and then I said to him, look, I found out he had never been able to go to a university in Israel, and he wanted to. So I said, look, Fawzi, those days were different than now. I said, Fawzi, I think I can arrange for you to be admitted first as a student. You'll have to learn English better. You have to learn English, but I think I can get you admitted to the university, even on a early kind of basis, and that will let us apply for a visa for you to stay in the U.S. So let's do that. And so we did that, and he went to, it was at the University of Bridgeport. They had one of the places that the US government had set up at universities to teach English as a foreign language. Now, of course, it's taught much more widely. So we went there for the summer, and we learned, but not enough. But then I found a wonderful professor of English at my university whose field it was to teach English as a foreign language, and he really liked Fawzi, and he taught him. And so then I took Fawzi, and I said, we'll live together. I said, I didn't at the time, because I only taught 2 days a week in Connecticut, and I would come back and forth to New York. But I said, I need an apartment in Connecticut. I knew I had to tell him something, because otherwise he wouldn't accept any. He wouldn't accept. So I said, we'll take an apartment together. So we did, and we lived together for 3 years. I'll just tell you one other quick story. When we took the apartment, he said, well, I don't have any money to pay for it. I said, look, Fawzi, I'll pay for it. And the only way he would take my paying for it and giving him some money was, I said, look, I'll keep a notebook that you see. And every time there's a payment for you, I'll mark it down. I'll mark it down. So later in life, when you earn money, you can repay me. When he graduated after 3 years, for the graduation present, I gave him the notebook. But anyway, so we lived together. Now, Fawzi is then the one, finally I come to Israel Shahak. Right. Finally, Fawzi's the one who told me about Israel Shahak. And of course, Uri Davis knew him too. And so I would go back and forth to Israel. So I went and I met Shahak in Israel, and we got along right away.
Let me ask you, what year is this? When did you meet him? What year?
It was 1972.
Okay, 72.
Okay. And I'm the one who told, and so I said to Israel Shahak, I told him about Elmer Berger, about my relationship and working with Elmer Berger. So then he said, I'm going to yell at Uri Davis for never telling me this before, because he said, I wanted to meet Elmer Berger. I said, fine, I'll arrange for you to come to the States, and then you'll meet Elmer Berger. So then what happened was, I'm the one who really brought Israel Shahak for the first few times that he came. I'm the one who brought him to the States, and I planned his first lecture tours. And then, of course, after he started lecturing and became, as well known as he needed to become because he was so good, he then created lots of other, he had more friends and things could be arranged, but I'm the one who brought it. That's how I met him.
Now, let me give a little background for those who don't know, but so Israel Shahak was born in Poland and thrown into the Warsaw Ghetto in the 40s. His family obviously horribly mistreated. He was a Holocaust survivor. He comes to Palestine, British Palestine, and then, I'm sorry?
In 1945.
45, and then when Israel declares independence, he's a citizen of Israel. He was in the army. I understand he was in an elite unit. Is that right?
Yes. Well, let me just say, when he went to Poland, his father died in the concentration camp. His mother and he were in first an early concentration camp. Then a Roman Catholic family. His mother gave him to a Roman Catholic family, and she paid them to hide him. And that went on for a while until she didn't have any money anymore and couldn't pay the family. So then the Nazis captured her and him and sent them to Bergen-Belsen, to the famous concentration camp. And then they were liberated by the U.S. Army, and then they went to Israel, to cut it short, in 45, and he got his primary education in a small village called Kfar Hasidim, and that's where he got Jewish education. It was a very Orthodox place. And then after that, he went for a little bit to Tel Aviv, and then he went to the Hebrew University, and he went through and got his PhD in chemistry. And they hired him. He became a professor there, as you know, of chemistry. And so he taught there. He taught at the Hebrew University from then until he came here to Stanford, and he did a year at Stanford postdoctoral. But he taught at the Hebrew University until he died in 2001. So, and he came to the States. I brought him to the States in 1972.
Now, as I understand it, he started, well, he was sort of a follower of Ben Gurion, kind of a conventional political person until 56, when Ben Gurion told the Israeli parliament that Ben Gurion, wanted to recreate the kingdom of David and Solomon. And that's when he sort of was starting.
Well, yeah, I would say that's one of the stories. Although the transition was, as you might guess, the transition was somewhat more expanded than that. In other words, he did go in. You mentioned before correctly that he did go in to the army as he'd become a citizen, as they did, and he was in an elite group. And by the way, he always referred back during his whole life to his army experience. And even though he hated what the Israelis would do with their army with the Palestinians, he fondly remembered his time in the army, by the way. So anyway, so what happened was it was kind of gradual. But by the time we come, and he moved from a real Zionist orientation to the other extreme, because he saw how Palestinians were treated. And so, yes, there is the story you talked about, but there are other things as well. And he met a few people. There were a few anti-Zionist Jews, very few, but there were a few, and he got to know them. So it was gradual. But by the time he came into the early to mid 1960s, he had already started to change, and so that's how it came over a period of time.
Now we're talking about him as a professor, and I read that he was involved with organic chemistry, and he had an international reputation for international reputation for cancer research. And I remember, I don't know if you told me or someone else, that even though politically he was kind of a pariah in Israel, he always was voted a top teacher at the university because they liked the way he taught.
Yes, that's right. Well, really, what happened, there are two areas that you just mentioned. One is he became very popular because he was such a good lecturer and teacher of chemistry. That's one thing, which he did. And he worked with a very famous nuclear scientist who was the chair of the chemistry department named Bergman, who loved him and so on, even though politically their views were totally opposite. But that didn't matter. So he had all of that. But then he also developed in other ways good relationships, when he would talk about other things as well. So there was the chemistry part. Now, insofar as the Zionist part was concerned, well, yes, he became at the Hebrew University for some years. He was first, well, I was going to say he was the most outstanding, the most controversial Israeli Jewish critic at the university. But it may be a bit of an exaggeration. He wasn't that all the time he was there, because then there were others. So, I mean, in terms of the anti-Zionism, there were a few at the Hebrew University who were also of that ilk, of which he was one. But he was the one who, in these earlier years, and by earlier years, I mean right through the 1970s, and even into the early 80s, he was the one who probably was the most famous of the anti-Zionists and the most hated.
Mm. And he joined the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights sometime after the Six-Day War. Can you talk about that group?
Yes, he became the chairman of the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights in 1970, and he remained the chairman until 1990. Now, when he joined, most of the people were people from Rakach, the Communist Party in the Knesset, which was the anti-Zionist party, as you know. And that party was made up as Shahak then made up the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights. It was made up of 50% Arabs. They couldn't quite have 50%. They didn't have so many in the Knesset. But it was made up of Arabs, of Palestinians, and Israeli Jews. So when Shahak set up the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights, he made as sure as he could that it always had an almost equal number of Palestinians and Israeli Jews. So yeah, and they, by the way, that Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights, as you know, they of course for a long time that was a major group that in Israel spoke out for the Palestinians and violations of human rights and so on. But they didn't limit themselves totally to Palestinians. They also talked about violations of human rights to Jews at times and so on. So anyway, but he was the chair for 20 years.
And at some point, he started writing, rather translating major articles in the Hebrew press and sending it out to friends and associates. Do you know when that started?
Yeah. Well, not only do I know when, but actually, Israel Shahak and I are the ones who started it. And he would do most of the translation. I'll tell you how we started it. We started it in the 70s, late 70s. And I went to a friend of mine who had a top position in the National Council of Churches. And he was a Quaker, and he was involved with American Friends for the Middle East. And so he was sort of, in the grouping. And he was interested. So actually, I got him to finance this to begin with. So actually, those translations, we did those translations. Shahak did most of them. We did them. And we printed them up at the National Council of Churches. And that's where they were sent out from. They sent out by National Council of Churches for a long time. And lots of people got them. But those really became known as, correctly, they became known as the Shahak papers. And they were what they were. That's right. You were exactly right. They were translations from the Israeli Hebrew press that had to do, of course, with Israeli-Palestinian affairs, relations, and so on.
And they would have a nice little introduction, almost always, sometimes very acid comments about something.
That's right. That's right. That's right. He did. Yes, that's exactly right.
And then there'd be footnotes sometimes too, and he would elaborate on some point and put
He
a
would
zinger in here.
Who got them? Yes, of course.
I look forward to getting them whenever.
They were terrific. They were terrific.
Yeah. Now I want to talk about another aspect of his life, his critique of Orthodox Judaism. Back in, let's see, I forget the year, but he writes a letter to Haaretz, And he said that he witnessed this outrageous situation where someone tried to use a telephone of an Orthodox Jew on a Sabbath to call an ambulance because someone, a non-Jew, had been injured. And the Orthodox Jew said, "Oh, it's a non-Jew? No, I'm not going to violate the sanctity of the Sabbath for that." Did he talk to you about that incident?
Yeah, well, let me paint a little background, because the background is first of all important. Shahak himself, I said when he was very young and he came to Israel in 1945 when he was 12 years old, he went to school in a yeshiva, in a Jewish religious school. And it was after he came out of that and he went in the army, he then turned against Orthodox Judaism. Now, there's an entry in Wikipedia by whoever wrote it that said he became an atheist. He never became an atheist. He wasn't an atheist. He was a big follower of Spinoza, but he wasn't but that's beside the point. But he became really antagonistic to Orthodox Judaism. And before he and I wrote together the book, first edition in 1991, and then I wrote a second edition after he died in 2003, Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. But before that, as I think you know, he wrote a smaller book called Jewish History, Jewish Religion.
The weight of 3,000 years.
Yeah, 3,000. And that, well, as you know, that's straight out a real attack against Orthodox Judaism. And I could go on and on about this, but I don't know. I really know, since I was with him for so often, for so long, here and in Israel when I go, I really know his views. I know his views. But all of that is background. Now, in the midst of this is when this story occurred. And he did write this. He did write this in a letter. He did write it. And then after that, even today, when you read things about Israel Shahak in some places, like even Wikipedia, they have a whole paragraph on just this, this story. And then he had lots of rabbis come out and say it's not really true. And in actuality, the story as it appears that he wrote, it's not, he tied it in, if not directly, indirectly, to Orthodox Judaism, because Orthodox Judaism is based on the Talmud, and he said this is Talmudic, so that's Orthodox Judaism. That's an overstatement. That's not all of Orthodox Judaism at all. That's not all of the rabbis. The Talmudic reference is, if you look at what he somehow refers to in Hebrew, it's a little vague, but let's put that aside. For now. So anyway, he did write it. But then that became the big controversy. And so then many Orthodox rabbis who were also leading Zionists, who really wanted to attack Israel Shahak, because as you know, when he came to the States, he got lots of publicity. I mean, he was really good when he ran around and lectured, and people loved him. I mean, you could just look at him and you would have to believe that this is a guy who was really telling you the truth. So anyway, so they hated him because of how good he was. And that's why those of us who promoted him, that's why we were so excited too about him, even though we loved him as a person. Okay, so they attacked him. So then what happened was, we then get this thing that people then said, he admitted that it really wasn't true. He admitted that it really wasn't true. You can't find that. Some people try to cite writing. I don't think you can find that in writing. They say he admitted it. Well, if you're asking me, and I was the closest to him. I don't know that he admitted it, and I don't know that he did not admit it. I don't really know that. I don't really know that. But that's the story. What's unfortunate, as far as I'm concerned, is whether he said it or not. Some people said he said it, and he said, I made it up because when I looked at things in the Talmud, there were things that pointed in that direction, so I fabricated this to make the point. Now, maybe that's true, but I don't know that it's true, and I don't know that it's not. So if you're asking me, that's my answer. I don't really know.
Well, you have Tom Segev, who wrote that this thing was a big controversy at the time, and that the Israel's ambassador to Austria heard about it and wrote to the prime minister about it and so on. And then finally that in the opinion of the Minister of Religious Affairs, Dr. Zera or Haftig, he didn't refute the rabbinical ruling, but said there was some exceptions allowed. So, I mean, Segev is a big historian, so, it's good enough for me.
You mean in terms of that's what Orthodox is? Yes, well, all I said at the beginning was, I said that, well, listen, Orthodox rabbis are certain, you can't put them all in the same category. Let me tell a quick analogy that indicates that. If we take Jews in the United States, let's say there are 6 million. Only 6 million here, 6 million plus in Israel, 15 million in the whole world. That's not very many. But of the 6 million Jews, only a percentage of them are religious. But what they do, what they say here, there are 3 major, denominations of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. That's not exactly true because there are a couple others. There's Reconstructionists. Forget that. But if you look at this, if you look at the conservative movement and the reform movement, in those movements, although all those rabbis don't agree, there's one national organization for conservative rabbis in the US and one national organization for reform rabbis in the United States. Now, with the Orthodox, we're only 10%. There are 28 different national organizations, and some of those, and then if you take it down smaller, like I know very well the ones that are the Hasidic or the mystical Jews, and that's a smaller percentage. But if you take the 2 largest of that small mystical group, the Lubavitchers and the Satmars, they dislike each other intensely, and they attack each other, and they say that this rabbi, this chief rabbi, and that rabbi. So all I'm saying is, with Orthodoxy, you simply can't make a total generalization. You can make a few generalizations, such as the Talmud is most important for all of them, but how they view the Talmud is another story.
Now, in that book, The Jewish History, Jewish Religion, he critiqued what he called classical Judaism. And he made many claims that most Orthodox religious leaders look down on non-Jews with contempt. And that became very controversial, and people heaped scorn on him.
Yeah. Now, I mean, look, I must say, as close as I was to Israel Shahak, and as much as I loved him, he was one of the, from my perspective, in certain areas, he was one of the greatest people that I've ever known. And if he wasn't a genius, because he knew a lot of stuff besides all that we're talking about, right, he was right on the verge. He was, in fact, and so there's a good reason why he was one of the closest friends of Noam Chomsky. One of the closest friends. they agreed politically on a lot of things, but that's not the point. The point is they could talk about all kinds of things. All right, now, but given how close I was to him, I myself don't agree with everything
Sure.
in his book, Jewish History, Jewish Religion, which is fine. Friends don't have to agree on everything, we know. All right. Now, but you see here, when classical, he did say classical Judaism. That was his term. Others use it too. That really means traditional Judaism. Traditional Judaism that is Orthodoxy, and that's the Judaism that existed up until the Enlightenment for a long, long time. I mean, up until the 17th into the 18th century of the Common Era. So that's what he's talking about. But as I've said before, even though there are some things that are all agreed upon, Orthodox rabbis especially agree upon, they disagree a lot. But the other thing is now, in terms of what you mentioned, a negative view, either a negative view or even hating non-Jews. Now, look, Shahak took that mostly. He was influenced mostly. This is Norton Mezvinsky now giving an opinion about Shahak. I mean, I think it's the correct opinion, but I want to say it's my opinion. He took his view as one would expect. He took his view mostly from Orthodox rabbis in Israel. And then when he came to the States, he then met Orthodox rabbis, lots of whom attacked him, who were of the same ilk, those two. But the point is, he didn't really include, he didn't include Orthodox rabbis as a general group within the United States. And if I then think about Orthodox rabbis in Israel and in the United States, I would say that you certainly can't say all of them. And I don't know for sure what percentage you can say. I'm talking about the Israeli rabbis. You have a percentage of them who fit that category, but I don't think a great majority who hate non-Jews per se. If you equate non-Jews and Palestinians, well, then different matter if you're talking about Palestinians, but they aren't the only non-Jews. So you see what I'm saying. In the United States, that's really not true.
So how often did you visit him in Israel?
Oh boy, we did lots of work together. We wrote our book together. I used to visit him twice a year.
Mm-hmm. And when you talked, was it all business, or did you go to entertainments?
Oh no. We did lots of other things. We did other things as well. And then it's not only we did other things in Israel, but for a period of years, since he wanted to do this, he wanted to go on a vacation for, let's say, 10 days or 2 weeks every summer. And what he said he wanted to do, he told me this before we started this. He said, I want to pick out one city, mostly in Europe. And I want to go to that city and I want to be in that city for that vacation. So he suggested we did it together. So I did it with him. And for me, it was a fantastic education. For example, we went to Istanbul one summer. He'd never been to Istanbul. And when I went with him, I never had either. I went times afterwards. But when we went to Istanbul, he'd never been there, but this shows you he took his own map, and then he took me around to churches in Istanbul that they had been churches. Well, they either had, and then After the First World War, they were then turned into mosques, and then they were churches again. But we would go to those churches, and we didn't have a guide. We would go around, and he would look up at the frescoes and the paintings, and he would give me a lecture on every one of those paintings, and he'd never been there before.
Wow.
Now, that was Istanbul. The same, when we went to Prague, that was Prague. That shows you. I mean, he was a person of fantastic knowledge. And he had, you say, visiting him in Israel, he had this small apartment. It was the messiest apartment you could even imagine. Not only the messiest I'd ever seen, it was the messiest you could even imagine. But you could hardly walk around, and it was small because there's so many books all over the place. And I remember on one trip, we were talking about something. It didn't have to do with Zionism or Israel or Palestinians or conflict, something else. All of a sudden, he goes to a top bookshelf. He picks out a book of Chinese history from the 17th century, and he shows me something in that book that pertained to our conversation. Now, there aren't many people that can do that.
Yeah. I understand he had a radio program where he talked about music.
Oh, yeah, he did. He was also that. I'm glad you raised it because that's something else. He was a real expert on music. And when you go to his apartment, he always had classical music playing. He always had it. He used to tell me that he had difficulty working in his apartment, which he did almost all the time, unless he had that music on. He did. He was an expert on music, too. And in fact, I can tell you a little story here. He became a close friend to Edward Said, as you may know. They became very close friends. And one thing, he admired a lot of things about Edward Said, but one thing he admired in addition to everything that concerned Israel, Palestine, Palestinians, even other academic things, he really admired Edward Said because Edward Said was such a brilliant pianist. You see. So yeah, he had a real love for music.
Yeah. So you co-wrote Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel with him, and you were mentioned in the 1990s. So what was that experience like?
Well, it was a fantastic experience. I learned a lot. I think he did too. A lot. I learned a lot, and maybe he learned a tiny little bit. But we wrote the book together. It was something. This is how we wrote it. We would, of course, correspond, and I'd go visit him. But I did not have a fax machine at the time. And so he insisted I get a fax. So that what we do is, when we wrote chapters, we would fax to one another, and then we would go over those chapters. And I must say, being really fair about it, we both did research for that book. He did more research than I did. In some of the research, he didn't have to do anew. Some I didn't either, but the research I did, I mostly had to do anew. He didn't have to, but he did some. He did some. We had our biggest disagreement about footnotes. I told him, I said, Israel, we need to have footnotes because it's a serious book. He didn't want to bother with that. And I couldn't prevail. I could prevail upon Israel Shahak once in a while, but I couldn't. Okay. But that's how we did it. And what would happen is, I say he did maybe a majority of the research. I did some. But when we'd write it, I would write some and then he'd write some. What he wrote, he said, this is my rough draft. So then he wanted the facts. So he would send me the facts, and then I would rewrite what he wrote. Sometimes I didn't have to, but sometimes I did. Because
Was this in English or Hebrew? Was this in English?
No, in English. We wrote it in English. We didn't write it in Hebrew. We wrote it in English. We had to do some things from the Hebrew to the English, but we wrote the book totally in English. Now, the book was translated into Hebrew, and then it was translated into 5 other languages as well. But this is a book in English.
And I haven't read the book in quite a while, but if I recall, one of the theses is that in Israel, some of the worst aspects of Orthodoxy, some of the worst, contempt for non-Jews came out, and a lot of rabbis would preach this thing in Israel.
Yeah, well, this is that happened here too, and it happened. It not only happened as far away as Israel, it happened in the Hartford Courant. They found a woman who knew nothing, and they had her write a review of the book, and it was just terrible. She called us both anti-Semites and all of this, and what she cited, this is typical of what other people do. What she cited was mostly wrong, and she would pick it out of context, she would cherry pick, and so on. And it was published in the Jewish Ledger. That's the name of the Jewish newspaper in Hartford. And I remember at the time when it came out, she did that, so I'm saying it's done here too. I called them, and I said what I thought, and they said, well, would you write? They said, well, you could write a criticism of her review. I said, yeah, I'll write it. I said, the only condition, which I'm sure you can understand, is I want you to print what I wrote. I don't want you to edit what I wrote. So the editor said, we can't agree to that. Of course we would edit it. So I said, well, forget it. So yeah, you're right. And I mean, most of the stuff, most all of it was we were in that book, not like Jewish history, Jewish religion, but in that book we were also critical of Orthodox Judaism in various ways, especially as it concerned Zionism, and I agreed with that. I must say that on a couple of the points that we made at the time, I suppose many other, I've tempered some of those points now myself a little bit, but they aren't major. They aren't the major things that were pointed out. And even though I tempered them, if I wrote that book over again, I'd write it the same way. I would just write something a little. I would include a few things and other things and so on. But that was overdone, as one might expect. That was overdone.
Now, the 1990s.
Let me tell you one other thing. I'm sorry. Let me tell you.
Okay.
There's something on the internet. I don't know whether you've ever seen it or not. It's called Academic EDU. And if you belong, it only costs something like $20 a year. And what they do is they go through, they find all of these things that are written, both published and even PhD dissertations. And so you have a real, and if they see what you're interested in, they write you and they cite, they tell you those things, and then they also, every time your name is mentioned in any of these publications, they write you and they say, last week you were cited 2 times or 4 times. Okay, so I get that, and I still get that every week. They say you're cited X number of times. Most of those citations, not all of them, but most of them are citations of our book, Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. So that's my point, not a citation about Norton Mezvinsky, but it's a citation about our book that is still used and referred to in all kinds of works, and in religious works, in theological works, in sociological works, written, and written by people with lots of different opinions, but they cite and use the book. So that tells me something about even the lasting importance of that book.
Sure. Now, the 1990s is basically his last decade. It's the era of Oslo and so on. Was he for the creation of a Palestinian state alongside of Israel? What did he think of the ideas of one state?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'll try not to be too lengthy in my answer because we talked about this a lot, and he talked about this a lot when he would meet Palestinians. And let me tell you one little interesting little side bit here. He would talk to Palestinians, of course, in Israel. But one thing that he wouldn't do, he wouldn't talk with, for many years, with any official members of the PLO, or what became the Palestinian National Authority, in Israel. When he came to the States, he would talk with them, and he always said the reason was when he talked with them, he also wanted to criticize them for things they said that were wrong and so on, and he didn't want to do it in Israel because he didn't want to add all the stuff against the Palestinians, so he would only do it when he was outside of Israel. So he did it in the U.S. Now, he would talk to other Palestinians. I mean, he talked to Edward Said, he talked to all of them, and so, okay, now, come to your question. Look, Shahak was not really in favor for a long time of a Palestinian state, per se. Don't forget, he changed a little bit. He died in 2001. Now, in 2001, I would say that's why it's complicated. He had changed to a point where he would consider it because of what happened, pragmatically, because of what had happened. But his whole point was he was such a great human rights advocate. That is, he would put almost all of his criticism about the state of Israel's oppression of Palestinians, and even his criticisms of Orthodox Judaism, he would put them in the category of human rights violations, human rights violations of other people. So for him, when he was talking about and was writing about the Palestinians and the great oppression of Palestinians, it's how they were so oppressed in terms of human rights. So for him, now he never said that he was sure that if and or when, especially when this could come about, but he would, of course, favor a state that was a state that gave equal human rights, at least in law, to Jews and non-Jews, which included Palestinians. And of course, he was always quick to point out, as was I and as am I, that that's a major reason why Israel has never had a constitution. Because if they had a constitution, they'd have to spell out the bases, if you have more than one basis, the bases of citizenship. And that would show that the non-Jews don't have the same basis of citizenship as Jews. And they never wanted that because it's hard to say we're a democratic state and the only democratic state in the Middle East, but we're a democratic state that gives Jewish citizens more rights and privileges by law than we give non-Jews. So anyway, that's the kind of state he envisioned. He really wanted.
Yeah. He was not so much interested in the one state, two state, that kind of structure as he was with human rights.
No. And I must say that no. And He never was, and especially after Oslo. It was shortly after Oslo, I must say. I'll jump away from him to me for a little bit. It was shortly after Oslo that I myself started to say, this is a fiction, that you could ever really have a two-state solution that would bring a more just situation for Palestinians. I just didn't think it would be. And then I, of course, have become more and more like that. And if Shahak were alive today, or if he had remained alive after he died in 2001 for the last almost 20 years, then he would have, he would have had, as you know very well, he would have had a lot more company of Palestinians, of Jews, of non-Palestinians, of non-Jews, who talk about why one state, why you have to have the ideal and the goal of one state as opposed to two states, which isn't going to come about anyway. He would have been right in that mix.
Now, he was ill with diabetes for many years, and that was the reason he retired from Hebrew University.
Yeah, he did. He also he did do that because of that, but he also told me, and he told others too, that he really wanted to devote himself even more to his concern with the conflict and with human rights and the Palestinians. He then, after he retired from the Hebrew University, he did take a job for a while with a major chemical institute in Haifa. He would go to Haifa, that was doing chemical research at the highest level. So, and some of it had to do with cancer. So that's a follow-up for him. So he did some of that. But that's the reason. But when he died, he had diabetes, but you can't say it's diabetes that killed him necessarily, because what happened, as you may know, he died of a heart attack. And this is really sad, because for all these years he lived alone.
He never married.
Never married, lived alone. It was right in the middle part of Jerusalem. And he had friends in Jerusalem, and he had one close friend that would visit him most days, but not all the time. And what happened was, one day the friend came and he didn't answer the door, and the friend went in and he found him dead on the floor. And then when and they don't do an autopsy for Jews in Judaism, but they said it was a heart attack. So he died of a heart attack.
Was his papers and all his books and all preserved or dispersed?
Well, no, this is really a kind of a sad story, at least to date. There are a few of us who have various of his papers. He didn't keep that. He kept his library, he kept some of his stuff, but then there are a lot of other things that he wrote. And I have a collection. Okay. Noam Chomsky, he used to write Noam Chomsky almost every week. So, and I asked Noam Chomsky a few years ago about those papers. When I brought him to my university to give a lecture, and I asked him. And he said, Norton, I have them, they're in boxes. And they're in boxes in my attic. That was a house he had before. And he said, I'm not going to go through them. But he said, if you want to come and go through all those boxes, he said, welcome, So he has. Then there are a couple other people who have kept some of his letters. But unfortunately, they're scattered around. And that's unfortunate. And
we're still waiting his biographer. We're awaiting his
We're
biography.
waiting, yeah, we're waiting his biographer, and now you bring up a sore spot for me because, and I've been working on this for a long time. And I'm going to finish it, I hope, soon. I'm doing a book which is not just a biography, and I want to do it it's not as a biography per se, because there's stuff you put in biographical stuff, but I'm interested in the ideas and what they said and what they did. So I'm writing a book where I'm talking about two people, Elmer Berger and Israel Shahak.
Mm.
And I was the closest person to Elmer Berger for the last 20 years of his life, like clearly the closest. And I was one of the very closest people, Israel Shahak. So there's no question that I'm a person to do that. Now, how well I do it, that remains to be seen, you say. But I am the person to do it, and I am trying to do that. But there I want to deal with, not just with biography. And you know, things that have been written, there have been small things, essays, that have been written about Shahak, some of which are, they have good things in them, they're pretty good, but they aren't really what we need. I mean, and with Elmer Berger, it's even worse because there have been, there's one book in a biography of his by a guy who interviewed me a few times and wrote a book that's pretty bad because you really don't get the core, the kernel, the in-depth part of their thought and of, you know, behind it. And that's what's important for both of those people. It's you know, what their ideas were, and then how they tried to translate their ideas into positive action.
Well, we've been talking for an hour now, and the idea that you're going to write or finish the book on Berger and Shahak sounds pretty exciting. So perhaps we should end here, maybe talk about it at another time, but this has been fascinating.
All right. I'm sorry if I went off a little bit in the conversation.
Well, the tangents were interesting.
It's hard for me to talk about Shahak without talking.
Well, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Sam. Bye-bye.